The date is July 29, 1944, a sweltering summer day in Normandy, France. The air is thick with the scent of cordite and the dust of pulverized stone. Along a narrow, sunken road near the village of Vaudeville, a German Panzer column from the elite Panzer Lehr division moves with lethal purpose. These are the finest tanks in the world. Panthers, sleek and deadly, commanded by men who believe they are invincible. Their objective is simple: crush the American breakthrough and restore the German front line. They are certain of their superiority. They have seen the enemy's tanks, the M4 Sherman, a squat, high-profile vehicle with a short-barreled gun. The Germans have a name for it, the Tommy Cooker, a grim joke about its supposed tendency to explode in a fireball. It is a tank they believe is fundamentally inferior. But what the Germans don't know is that the American tank commanders have been told a secret, a new tactic, a last-ditch innovation born from months of bloody stalemate. On the American side of the hedgerows, tanks of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, hell on wheels, are dug in waiting. Among them is a young crew, their faces smudged with grease and anticipation. They have been told to stay hidden, to let the enemy come to them. The lead German Panther rolls forward, its massive 75mm KWK-42 gun traversing slowly. It is a killing machine. But as it turns a corner, it exposes its unangled side armor, a vulnerability its crew believes to be a non-factor against the American tanks. The moment is a study in quiet, lethal tension. Then a flash. Not a roar, but a crack. The sound of a high-velocity shell tearing through the air. The shell strikes the side of the Panther, not ricocheting as it would from the front, but penetrating cleanly. A second shell follows and then a third. The Panther lurches, a pillar of black smoke erupting from its engine deck. Its turret stops moving. The hatch pops open and a crewman scrambles out, only to be cut down by machine gun fire. Within seconds, the pride of the Panzer Lehr is a smoldering ruin. The German command, listening on their radios, hears the frantic, disbelieving reports. The American tanks are not retreating. They are not being knocked out one by one from a distance. They are fighting back and they are winning. How could a tank they had so confidently dismissed, a tank so seemingly outmatched on paper, be destroying their most advanced armor? The answer would come not from a single miraculous shot, but from a strategic revolution that would rewrite the rules of tank warfare and break the back of the German resistance in the West. To understand the shock of that moment, you must first understand the German perspective. By mid-1944, the Wehrmacht's armored forces had cemented a reputation for undeniable superiority. From the Blitzkrieg campaigns that swept across Europe in 1940 to the brutal, grinding tank battles on the Eastern Front, German tanks, and the doctrine that employed them, were considered the gold standard. The Panzer V Panther and the Tiger I and II were technological marvels, each a statement of German engineering and tactical philosophy. The Panther, in particular, was a formidable beast. It was designed in direct response to the Soviet T-34, which had shocked German commanders in 1941. The Panther's sloping frontal armor, with an effective thickness of nearly 90mm at a 56-degree angle, was almost impenetrable to the standard 75mm M3 gun of the early M4 Sherman. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away, while the Sherman's gun could do little more than tickle the Panther at long range, even at point-blank range against the frontal glacis. This disparity created a psychological as well as a physical advantage for German tankers. They operated from a position of perceived invincibility, confident that their armor would protect them while their guns could destroy any foe. This belief was not unfounded. In a head-on duel, a German Panther or Tiger would almost always win. This, on paper, superiority became a core tenet of German armored doctrine. They sought out long-range engagements, using their powerful optics and high-velocity guns to pick off Allied tanks from a distance. German commanders, like General Paul Hauser of the 7th Army and General Gunther von Kluge of Army Group B, were keenly aware of their tanks' technical advantages. They viewed the M4 Sherman with a mixture of contempt and bemusement. The Sherman was tall, its gasoline engine was prone to catching fire when hit, and its early models carried a gun with a relatively low muzzle velocity. To the German command, the M4 was a mass-produced compromise, a vehicle built for quantity, not quality. The battle for Normandy in the weeks following D-Day reinforced this belief. The Germans, though under constant pressure from Allied air superiority, used the dense, maze-like hedgerow terrain, known as the bocage, to their advantage. They turned every field into a killing zone, and every hedgerow into an anti-tank trap. American tank crews found themselves in a difficult, grinding fight. The German tanks, despite being outnumbered, used their superior optics and firepower to devastating effect from hidden positions. Casualties mounted, and American morale began to fray. The tankers, facing a seemingly unassailable foe, began to believe the German propaganda. They felt that their Shermans were indeed just death traps. The German leadership felt confident that they had contained the Allied beachhead. While the British and Canadians fought a bloody, attritional battle around Caen, the American forces were locked in a slow, brutal slog in the west. The Germans had successfully prevented any major breakthrough. Their Panzer divisions, though battered, were holding the line. They were certain they could grind down the enemy until they were exhausted. They were overconfident, blind to their own vulnerabilities, and wholly unprepared for the true nature of the enemy they faced, not just a tank but an entire, highly adaptive war machine. The American predicament in Normandy was grim. After the high water mark of D-Day, the campaign had settled into a brutal, claustrophobic grind. The Allied forces, despite overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority, were bogged down. The terrain itself was the enemy's greatest ally. The bocage, with its centuries-old hedgerows and sunken roads, turned every small field into a miniature fortress. German infantry and anti-tank teams could hide in the thick vegetation, waiting to ambush unwary Allied vehicles. The German 88mm anti-tank gun was a constant, terrifying threat. For the American tankers, the situation was particularly demoralizing. Their M4 Shermans, while reliable and easy to maintain, were simply not designed for the kind of head-on duels they were being forced into. The standard 75mm gun was excellent for infantry support, firing a high-explosive round that was devastating against soft targets and fortifications. But against a German Panther, its performance was lackluster. Frontal engagements were a death sentence. Letters home from American soldiers painted a stark picture of the battlefield. The historian Stephen Ambrose, in his book Citizen Soldiers, quotes one tank commander who wrote, "Our Shermans are not good. The Germans have better armor and better guns. We lose a tank for every one of theirs." This feeling of being outgunned began to circulate among the crews, a macabre reference to the cigarette lighter brand slogan, "Lights up every time." The high rate of Shermans burning after being hit, a result of the early model's ammunition storage and gas engines, gave this macabre joke a painful reality. Logistics were a constant struggle. The Allied push had advanced faster than anticipated in some areas, but the capture of the deep-water port of Cherbourg did not immediately solve the supply crisis. The sheer volume of men, vehicles, and ammunition required for the offensive strained the system to its limits. Everything had to be brought in over the D-Day beaches or through smaller, temporary ports. The American commanders, including General Omar Bradley and Major General J. Lawton Collins, were acutely aware of the risk of the campaign devolving into a World War I-style stalemate. They needed to break out, but how? The frustration was palpable at every level. The U.S. Army leadership, especially the new U.S. Third Army commander, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., was known for his aggressive, fast-paced blitzkrieg style of warfare. But even Patton's forces were bottled up, unable to exploit the breakthroughs they desperately needed. There was a sense of desperation, a feeling that they were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. The German commanders, with their superior tanks and defensive expertise, seemed to hold all the cards. But this period of stasis was not one of inaction. Beneath the surface, a quiet, determined effort was underway. The stalemate had given Allied engineers and tacticians an opportunity to study the problem. They knew they could not defeat the German tanks in a fair fight. They could not outproduce them in terms of heavy armor. The solution, they realized, had to be a new one, a paradigm shift that would transform the battlefield from a static, attritional hellscape into a fluid, fast-paced conflict where the Sherman's true strengths, speed, reliability, and sheer numbers, could finally be unleashed. The answer would not be a bigger gun or thicker armor, but something far more ingenious. The secret to breaking the Normandy stalemate was not a single, grand invention but a combination of tactical and technological adaptations, some of them simple, some audacious. The first, and most important, was the development of the Rhino tank. The idea was born of pure necessity. An American sergeant, Curtis G. Cullen, Jr., observed that the dense, earthy hedgerows of the bocage were not just obstacles but fortified barriers that made tank warfare a nightmare. They were too thick to be simply pushed through, and trying to climb over them exposed the vulnerable underbelly of the tank to German anti-tank fire. Cullen's solution was deceptively simple. He took steel prongs from German Czech hedgehogs, the anti-invasion obstacles found on the beaches, and welded them to the front of a Sherman tank. The prongs, or tusks, would cut through the hedgerow's root system, allowing the tank to burst through the foliage without exposing its soft underside. The idea was immediately recognized as a game changer. The innovation was quickly scaled up, with thousands of Shermans receiving the improvised modifications in the days leading up to the Breakout offensive. The second key innovation was not a piece of hardware but a shift in doctrine. The German reliance on heavy tanks with powerful, long-barreled guns meant they were most effective at distance. The Americans realized they couldn't win this game. Instead of seeking head-on engagements, they decided to avoid them altogether. The new tactic, championed by commanders like General Patton, was to use the Sherman's superior mobility and fast-traversing turret to get close and personal. The Sherman's turret could traverse 360 degrees in less than 15 seconds, a crucial advantage over the much slower Panther, which took almost a minute. This meant a Sherman could quickly pivot to face a threat or, more importantly, a target's weak side. The new doctrine called for American tankers to use their speed and numbers to outflank and encircle German positions. Instead of a linear slugfest, the battle would become a chaotic, three-dimensional chess game. The objective was no longer to kill the tank, but to destroy the unit. The final piece of the puzzle was the most subtle but perhaps most critical: combined arms synergy. The American and British armies had mastered the art of coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and most importantly, air power. While German tanks were superior on the ground, the Allies commanded the sky. The U.S. Army Air Forces and the RAF had a new weapon, the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bomber. These aircraft, often called the Jug by their pilots, were armed with powerful rockets and bombs that could obliterate German tank columns from above. The new American strategy was to lure the German armor into the open, then call in devastating air strikes to turn the tide. This wasn't a secret weapon in the traditional sense, but a secret strategy, a complete re-evaluation of how to fight the German armored forces. It was a strategy that turned the Shermans' perceived weaknesses into strengths. Its tall silhouette meant better crew visibility, its spacious interior allowed for more effective crew operation, and its reliability meant that more Shermans were on the front line at any given moment than their breakdown-prone German counterparts. The American plan was not to meet the German army head-on, but to outthink it, outmaneuver it, and overwhelm it with a relentless, multifaceted assault. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only prove the Shermans' worth but change the face of the war. The tension in the Norman countryside was almost unbearable in the days leading up to Operation Cobra. For 7 weeks, the Allied forces had been cooped up in a narrow beachhead, fighting a brutal, attritional battle of inches. The weather, which had delayed the initial breakout plan, was finally cooperating. On July 24th, the day before the offensive, the air was heavy and still. Soldiers checked their gear, polished their boots, and wrote last-minute letters home. The atmosphere was a mix of nervous energy and grim determination. The plan, as laid out by General Omar Bradley, was a bold one. The U.S. First Army, with its 7 and 8 Corps, would launch a concentrated attack west of St. Lo. This was not a general assault, but a narrow, focused effort designed to punch a hole in the German defenses. The target area, a rectangle roughly 6,000 yards long and 2,500 yards wide, was chosen because it was believed to be the weakest point in the German line. The American spearhead would be led by the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, with the U.S. 4th Armored Division in reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough. Behind the lines, the logistical buildup was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of troops, tens of thousands of vehicles, and a mountain of supplies were poised to strike. Tanks of the 2nd Armored Division, their turrets newly adorned with the telltale prongs of the Rhino modification, sat silently, their engines cool, their crews preparing for the grueling advance. The soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division, positioned to lead the initial push, were exhausted from weeks of fighting but were bolstered by the sheer scale of the force. While aware of the Allied buildup, misread the intent. Their commanders, fixated on the British and Canadian attacks around Caen, believed the primary Allied effort was still in the east. Hitler's orders were to hold the line at all costs and to prepare for a counterattack. General Hausser, his Panzer Lehr and 2nd SS Panzer divisions battered but still potent, was committed to holding the line at St. Lo. They were expecting more of the same, a grinding infantry battle with sporadic tank skirmishes. They had no idea they were about to be hit by a tactical blitzkrieg of a scale they had never before experienced. At 11 a.m. on July 24th, the offensive was supposed to begin, but an unexpected turn of weather, low cloud ceilings, forced a delay. Allied bombers, already in the air, were given a last-minute order to return to base, but some crews, not hearing the order, dropped their bombs anyway. The result was a catastrophic friendly fire incident, with over 100 American soldiers killed, including the highest-ranking officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater, Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair. The tragic accident cast a pall over the impending offensive. The delay, however, was a blessing in disguise. It allowed the air bombardment to be rescheduled for the next day, a day with perfect weather for an aerial carpet bombing that would truly shock the German defenses into submission. As night fell on July 24th, the battlefield was eerily quiet. The soldiers on both sides waited in the dark, the air thick with tension. The only sounds were the distant rumble of artillery and the hum of unseen aircraft. The Germans were confident but overstretched. The Americans were cautious but well prepared and armed with a new, secret strategy. The stage was set for the decisive Battle of Normandy. At 9:38 a.m. on July 25, 1944, the world seemed to tear itself apart. Over 1,000 B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers, followed by an additional 1,000 medium bombers, unleashed a torrent of high-explosive ordnance on a narrow, 2.5 square mile stretch of the German front lines west of St. Lo. The air became a cacophony of thunderous detonations and a sky-darkening cloud of dust and debris. The Germans, sheltered in their dugouts and reinforced bunkers, had never experienced a bombardment of this scale. The ground literally shook and the shock waves were felt miles away. Following the bombers, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang fighter bombers swooped in, strafing and rocketing anything that moved. The effect was immediate and devastating. German communication lines were severed, command bunkers were buried, and entire sections of the front line were simply vaporized. The Panzer Lehr division, which was holding the center of the line, was hit particularly hard. At 11 a.m., as the last bombs fell, the ground assault began. Tanks of the U.S. 7 Corps, led by Major General J. Lawton Collins, surged forward. The Rhino tanks, their steel tusks tearing through the hedgerows, proved their worth immediately. They sliced through the dense foliage as if it were grass, surprising German defenders who expected the tanks to be funneled into narrow lanes. The Germans, dazed and shell-shocked by the bombardment, were caught completely off guard. Their defensive positions, designed to withstand a conventional infantry assault, were now open and exposed. The battle became a series of small, desperate skirmishes. Tank companies of the U.S. 2nd Armored and U.S. 3rd Armored Divisions, rather than engaging in a head-on slugfest, used their speed to bypass German strongpoints. A Sherman would blast a hole in a hedgerow, and then a platoon of others would pour through, flanking German positions and engaging them from the side or rear. One after-action report from the 2nd Armored Division describes a particularly chaotic scene on July 26. We came upon a German Panzer IV, dug in on a knoll. Before they could even traverse their gun, we were on their flank. 3 of our Shermans opened fire. The Panzer IV was a smoking wreck in seconds. They didn't even get off a shot. The U.S. 4th Armored Division, under the aggressive command of Major General John S. Wood, was unleashed on July 28. Known for their speed, they raced through the broken German lines. The German command, in a desperate attempt to restore the front, ordered the battered Panzer Lehr and 2nd SS Panzer divisions to counterattack. This was exactly what the Americans wanted. The German tanks, stripped of their infantry and artillery support by the bombing, advanced in a confused, uncoordinated manner. Near the town of Coutances, the 4th Armored Division's tank columns encountered the German counterattack head-on. A platoon of Shermans, using the new flanking tactics, engaged a company of Panthers. An American tank commander, quoted in a declassified report, recounts the encounter. "They had us cold from the front, but we didn't go for a head-on. We used our speed, drove into the fields on their flanks. Their long guns couldn't traverse fast enough. We were hitting them from the side and rear, where their armor was thin. One of our 75mm rounds took out a Panther from the side at 200 yards. They just weren't built for that." The German Panthers, magnificent at long range, were clumsy and slow in a close-quarters brawl. The battle turned into a rout. The Rhino innovation, the aggressive flanking maneuvers, and the relentless air support, it was a combination the German armor had no answer for. Within 6 days, the American forces had advanced over 30 miles, a feat unimaginable just a week prior. The German front had not just bent, it had been shattered. Operation Cobra had transformed the static, bloody Battle of Normandy into a fast-paced, fluid war of maneuver, and the lowly M4 Sherman had proven to be its perfect instrument. The German reaction to Operation Cobra was a mix of disbelief, confusion, and panic. The strategic brilliance of the Allied plan, using the British and Canadian attacks on Caen to draw the bulk of the German armor to the east, while the Americans prepared to strike a weakened Western front, had worked perfectly. The German commanders had been so focused on the head-on fight they expected that they were completely unprepared for the rapid, deep penetration. Captured documents and after-action reports from the German side tell a story of a command structure in disarray. Interrogation reports of captured German officers revealed their shock. They expected the American attack to be a slow, methodical advance, but what they faced was a relentless, unstoppable flood of men and machines. The speed of the American armored divisions, particularly the U.S. 4th Armored, was a revelation. General Otto von Manschufel, a German panzer commander, later remarked on the unexpected speed and audacity of the American advance. The American forces, which we had previously considered slow, were suddenly fast and were not just outmaneuvered, they were annihilated. The Panzer Lehr division, considered one of the Wehrmacht's finest formations, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The initial aerial bombardment, followed by the relentless tank infantry teams, had broken their will to fight. German tank crews, once confident in their superior armor, found themselves in a terrifying new reality. They would watch as American tanks, which they believed to be harmless from the front, would slice through a hedgerow and appear on their flanks, their guns trained on the vulnerable side armor. The German High Command's rigid adherence to no retreat orders from Hitler exacerbated the disaster. Instead of allowing their battered forces to withdraw and regroup, they were forced to stand their ground, even as their lines were collapsing. This created the perfect conditions for a massive encirclement. As the American forces broke through and swung east, they met up with the British and Canadian forces swinging west. The Germans were trapped in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket. The roads leading out of the pocket became killing grounds. Allied artillery and air power mercilessly pounded German columns of tanks, trucks, and men. The German losses were staggering. The Normandy campaign, which had begun as a slow, attritional fight, had suddenly become a rout. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army lost over 50,000 men and thousands of vehicles, including nearly all their remaining tanks and heavy equipment. The once vaunted German Panzer divisions were reduced to disorganized remnants. The collapse was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological one. The German myth of armored superiority had been shattered, not by a single super tank, but by a combination of ingenuity, mobility, and overwhelming force. The M4 Sherman, once mocked, had proven its worth not as a duelist, but as a crucial component of a new, unstoppable form of warfare. The immediate aftermath of Operation Cobra was a dramatic and sweeping change in the war in Western Europe. The breakout at St. Lo was not just a tactical victory, it was a strategic masterstroke that set in motion a chain of events that would lead to the liberation of France and the eventual collapse of the Third Reich. Following the breakout, the U.S. Third Army, under General Patton, was unleashed. Patton's armored divisions, now operating in the open countryside where their speed and mobility could be fully exploited, roared across France. They bypassed German strongholds, cut off supply lines, and created chaos in the enemy's rear. The race to the Seine River and then to the Rhine had begun. The losses to the German army were catastrophic. In the Falaise Pocket, which was the direct result of Operation Cobra's success, the Germans lost an estimated 60,000 men, killed or captured. Their armored forces were effectively wiped out in the West. Declassified intelligence summaries from the period note a dramatic drop in German morale and fighting capability. German military leadership, now under immense pressure from both the collapsing front and a furious Hitler, was in chaos. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B, was recalled to Germany and committed suicide, fearing a court-martial for his failure. Political repercussions were felt on both sides of the Atlantic. In the U.S., the slow, bloody progress in Normandy had led to public concern and media criticism. The success of Operation Cobra and the subsequent rapid advance across France restored confidence in the Allied high command and their strategy. American newspapers, which had previously questioned the effectiveness of the M4 Sherman, now hailed the ingenuity of the Rhino tanks and the speed of the American armored divisions. Operation Cobra demonstrated the power of combined arms at a grand, operational scale. It showed that tanks, when used in concert with infantry, artillery, and air power, were more than just individual fighting machines. They were a force multiplier. This lesson was not lost on the Germans, who had built their own Panzer doctrine around a similar concept but had failed to adapt to the new realities of the battlefield, particularly Allied air superiority. The success of the operation also validated the American logistical and production system. The M4 Sherman, for all its perceived flaws, could be produced in immense numbers, repaired quickly in the field, and was reliable enough to sustain a relentless advance. This was a critical factor in a war of attrition. While the Germans built a few magnificent but mechanically complex and fragile Tiger II tanks, the Americans flooded the battlefield with thousands of reliable Shermans. The strategic genius of the M4 was not its power, but its availability. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, a direct consequence of the breakout, was a moment of global celebration. The swift advance across France cemented the Allied position in Western Europe and put them on the doorstep of Germany. The war was far from over, but the myth of German invincibility had been irrevocably shattered, and the path to final victory, though still difficult, was now clear. The legacy of the M4 Sherman and Operation Cobra extends far beyond the fields of Normandy. The events of July and August 1944 fundamentally changed the way the world looked at tank warfare and military strategy. Post-war analysis by military historians and engineers showed that the German doctrine of building bigger, more heavily armored, and more complex tanks was a strategic dead end. While the Panther and Tiger were formidable in a one-on-one fight, they were a logistical nightmare. They were slow to build, difficult to repair, and suffered from frequent mechanical breakdowns. The Sherman, on the other hand, was the ultimate embodiment of mass production and tactical flexibility. It was an all-rounder tank that could be adapted for a variety of roles. The British, for example, successfully modified the Sherman into the Firefly variant, equipping it with a high-velocity 17-pounder gun that could defeat the German tanks head-on. The Americans continued to upgrade the Sherman throughout the war, adding a more powerful 76mm gun and improving its survivability. The post-war analysis found that the much-maligned Sherman, particularly the versions with wet ammunition storage, had one of the lowest burn rates of any tank in the war, a fact that directly challenged the Ronson myth. The American approach, as demonstrated in Operation Cobra, was not to build a better duelist, but to develop a better ecosystem for warfare. They understood that the tank was not a standalone weapon but a component of a larger system. The tactical use of combined arms, the strategic use of air power, and the logistical superiority of American American industry proved that the whole was greater than the sum of its parts. This lesson became the foundation of modern Western military. No longer seen as a death trap but as a war winner. Military historians and academic institutions, from the U.S. Army Center of Military History to museums like the Imperial War Museum, have re-evaluated its performance. They conclude that the tank's reputation for inferiority was largely a result of German propaganda, reinforced by the painful close-range encounters of the early Normandy campaign. The encounters between American Shermans and German heavy tanks were statistically rare. The vast majority of German tank losses in Normandy were due to a combination of air power, artillery, and tank destroyers. The story of the Sherman and Operation Cobra is a testament to the power of adaptation and strategic thinking. It's a lesson that success in war is not always about having the biggest or most powerful weapon. It's about how you use what you have. The engineers who designed the Rhino tusks, the commanders who championed new tactical doctrines, and the tank crews who learned to fight a different kind of war, they all played a part in turning a perceived weakness into a decisive advantage. The story of the Sherman is a story of innovation triumphing over brute force, of American ingenuity bulldozing a path to victory. The story of the M4 Sherman in Normandy is a powerful parable of war and human ingenuity. It is a story not of a single weapon's perfection, but of an entire military's ability to adapt, to overcome setbacks, and to find a way to win. The legend of the all-powerful German Panzers, so prevalent in post-war culture, often obscures the true nature of the conflict. The Germans built magnificent machines, but they were machines that lacked a coherent, sustainable strategic vision. The American M4 Sherman, for all its technical shortcomings in a theoretical one-on-one duel, was the right tool for the right job at the right time. It was the product of a nation with a deep industrial base and a military that understood the importance of logistics, reliability, and the power of combined arms. General George S. Patton Jr., a man who understood the value of the Sherman better than most, wrote in a letter to the Milwaukee Journal in March 1945, "The M4 Sherman is not a superior tank when put in a head-on duel, but military commanders win battles and tactics win battles. The Sherman, by virtue of its greater mobility, can outmaneuver the Tiger and attack from the rear." His words captured the essence of the entire Normandy campaign. The American victory was not won by having a bigger gun, but by a collective act of courage, innovation, and determination. It was a victory not for a tank, but for an entire army that refused to be defeated by a seemingly superior foe. They mocked the Sherman, and then it bulldozed German defenses and liberated a continent. It is a lesson that echoes across the decades, reminding us that in the end victory is not about brute strength, but about an unbreakable will to win.